They called her plane a flying tank, too slow for modern warfare, until the day she single-handedly turned a massacre into a miracle and proved that sometimes the tortoise really does beat the hare. What happened next would rewrite everything. The Air Force thought it knew about aerial combat and the quiet woman who flew the ugliest bird in the sky. The Nevada sun blazed across Nellis Air Force Base like a blowtorch against steel, transforming the flight line into a shimmering ocean of heat that made the distant mountains dance like mirages. By 0800 hours, the temperature had already crawled past 95 degrees, and the asphalt was soft enough to take boot prints from anyone foolish enough to stand still too long. Smart pilots stayed in the air-conditioned briefing rooms, nursing coffee that had gone cold hours ago and complaining about the desert duty that felt more like exile than assignment. Captain Sarah Bulldog Vance wasn't most pilots. She walked across the scorching tarmac with the measured stride of someone who'd learned that hurried movements wasted energy and drew unwanted attention. No flight suit adorned her compact frame yet, just desert camouflage utilities that had seen real combat, boots that bore the scuff marks of foreign soil, and a simple braid that revealed tan lines where her helmet usually rested. Everything about her seemed unremarkable, forgettable even, except for the way she carried herself. There was something deliberate about her movement, economical and purposeful, like someone who'd learned that every step counted when you were flying low and slow over hostile territory where a wrong turn could mean the difference between coming home with everyone intact and leaving pieces of yourself scattered across some godforsaken valley. The security checkpoint guard barely looked up from his clipboard, just waved her through with the bored efficiency of someone who'd processed 1,000 faces and forgotten them all by lunch. Sarah nodded once and kept walking, her flight bag slung over one shoulder, transfer orders folded neatly in her breast pocket. She'd been up since 0430, sitting on the edge of a base lodging bed that smelled like industrial bleach and the ghosts of 1,000 temporary assignments. The kind of place where transient aircrew caught a few hours of sleep between missions and tried not to think about how far they were from anything resembling home. Her gear had been arranged on the room's single chair with the kind of military precision that became second nature after enough years of living out of duffel bags. Clean uniforms pressed tight, personal items secured in regulation containers, and at the bottom, wrapped in a faded Squadron patch, a photograph she hadn't looked at in 6 months. She'd pulled it out that morning, held it up to the weak light filtering through aluminum blinds, and made herself remember 4 figures on a loading ramp somewhere in Afghanistan, dust clouds swirling behind them like brown ghosts. Her in the center, helmet tucked under her arm, flanked by her ground crew and her wingmen, all of them squinting against the sun and the rotor wash from a departing helicopter. All of them young enough to believe they were invincible and experienced enough to know better. The crew chief had made it home, got out, started a garage in Montana where he restored vintage aircraft and never talked about the war. According to his annual Christmas cards, he was married now and had never been happier building things instead of maintaining them for combat. The wingman never made it past the second tour. A surface-to-air missile took his F-16 down over a valley, whose coordinates were still classified and whose name appeared on no public maps. His daughter was graduating from the Air Force Academy next month, had her father's steel-gray eyes and his stubborn determination to prove herself in a world that still questioned whether women belonged in fighter cockpits. She'd probably never heard of Captain Sarah Vance, and that was exactly how Sarah preferred it. Inside the Squadron operations building, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the desert furnace. 3 pilots lounged around a metal table, their flight suits unzipped to regulation minimum, name tags gleaming like badges of honor under fluorescent lights that hummed with electrical persistence. They were laughing about something on a tablet screen, probably a video of some ground attack mission where precision munitions had turned enemy positions into smoking craters in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The kind of humor That developed when you spent your days moving faster than sound and delivering death from distances measured in miles rather than meters. One wore the confident smirk of someone who'd never questioned his place in the aerial food chain, his F-22 patch catching the light like a trophy. Another clutched an energy drink like it contained the secrets of sustained flight operations. His F-35 Squadron emblem freshly sewn and still creased from the package. The third pilot, older and more weathered, bore the scars of someone who'd transitioned through multiple aircraft generations, his collection of patches telling a story of adaptation and survival that spanned 2 decades of aerial warfare. Sarah approached their makeshift command center, her posture straight but not aggressive, her expression neutral as winter sky. She could hear fragments of their conversation now, technical discussions punctuated by the casual arrogance that came from piloting machines that cost more than small countries' annual budgets and flew like angels of destruction, wrapped in titanium and computer code. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Captain Sarah Vance stopped 3 feet from their table and waited with the patience of someone who'd learned that interrupting the wrong conversation at the wrong moment could get you labeled as everything from pushy to presumptuous. Her green eyes took in details that most people missed, cataloging information with the systematic efficiency of someone whose survival had once depended on reading rooms full of strangers and understanding the power dynamics at play before opening. Her mouth. The F-22 pilot's name tag read Viper Martinez, and his flight suit bore the crisp edges of someone who'd spent more time in climate-controlled briefing rooms than in actual combat zones. His hands were smooth, manicured even, the hands of someone who'd never had to change a tire in hostile territory or field strip a weapon by moonlight. The F-35 pilot, calcine Razor Thompson, couldn't have been more than 26. His energy drink grip revealing the slight tremor of someone who lived on caffeine and adrenaline, because sleep was for people who didn't fly the most advanced fighter aircraft in human history. The older pilot interested her most. Major Hawk Peterson bore the weathered look of someone who'd seen combat in multiple theaters, his face carrying the kind of permanent squint that came from staring into distant horizons while calculating missile approach vectors and threat assessment matrices. His flight suit was faded in places where equipment rubbed against fabric during countless sorties, and his boots showed the scuff patterns of someone who'd walked across more foreign airfields than he could probably remember. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Peterson was old school Air Force, probably started his career flying the 4 Skyhawks or early F-16s, before transitioning through the technological revolution that had transformed aerial warfare from dogfighting into a game of sensors and stealth signatures. He would have opinions about everything, especially about pilots who flew aircraft that couldn't break the sound barrier or disappear from radar screens like electronic ghosts. "You see this?" Viper was saying, tapping his tablet screen with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a particularly good joke. Some A-10 pilot in Afghanistan took out 12 Taliban positions with a single gun run. Took her 45 minutes to make one pass because that pig flies so slow the ground troops probably had time to finish their lunch and file their after-action reports. Razor laughed, the sound sharp and cutting in the refrigerated air. 45 minutes? I could have hit those same targets from 60 miles out with J.D. Abrams and been back at base before she even acquired the target. Hell, they wouldn't have even known I was there until their world turned to fire and smoke. Hawk shook his head with the weary patience of someone who'd had this conversation 1,000 times with 1,000 different young pilots who confused technology with capability. You kids don't understand the A-10. It's not about speed or stealth. It's about staying in the fight when everything else goes to hell. That bird can take damage that would turn your pretty jets into aluminum confetti and still bring the pilot home. Damage? Viper scoffed, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never had to test his aircraft's durability against anything more challenging than turbulence. The whole point of modern air superiority is not getting hit in the first place. Why fly into the teeth of enemy fire when you can eliminate threats from beyond visual range? The A-10 is a relic from a different kind of war, when pilots had to get their hands dirty and their aircraft shot full of holes. Sarah continued to wait, her breathing controlled and steady, her posture relaxed but ready. She'd heard variations of this conversation in squadron-ready rooms from Nevada to North Carolina. Always the same arguments between pilots who flew different missions with different aircraft designed for different purposes. The fast movers always looked down on the Warthog drivers, seeing them as throwbacks to an earlier era of aviation when getting close to the enemy was considered necessary rather than foolish, what they never understood, what they couldn't understand. Without spending time in the cockpit of an A-10, flying low-level missions over terrain that could hide entire armies in its folds and shadows, was that sometimes the mission required more than pushing buttons and watching targets disappear. Puffs of digital smoke on high-resolution displays. Sometimes the mission required staying in the fight when the enemy shot back, when the weather turned hostile, when communications failed and GPS signals got jammed, and the only thing standing between friendly forces and complete disaster was a pilot willing to get close enough to see the whites of the enemy's eyes. Plus, Razor added, his voice gaining momentum as he warmed to his theme, the A-10 is basically a flying target in any contested airspace. No stealth, no speed, no electronic countermeasures worth mentioning. Any competent surface-to-air missile system would swat one down like a mosquito at a barbecue. The whole concept is obsolete. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind her eyes, a brief spark that suggested these weren't just theoretical discussions for her. She'd flown in contested airspace, had missiles fired at her aircraft, had felt the impact of small arms fire against armored cockpit walls while maintaining steady gun runs that kept ground forces alive when no other aircraft could provide the precision and persistence they needed to survive. Sarah cleared her throat once, a soft sound that nonetheless cut through the conversation like a blade through silk. The three pilots looked up from their discussion, their expressions shifting from animated enthusiasm to polite curiosity to something approaching annoyance as they registered the interruption to their technical debate about aircraft capabilities and mission effectiveness. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, her voice carrying the neutral professionalism of someone who'd learned to navigate military hierarchies without triggering unnecessary confrontations. Captain Sarah Vance, reporting for temporary duty assignment with the 64th Aggressor Squadron. She reached into her breast pocket and withdrew a manila folder, its edges crisp despite the desert heat, its contents organized with the kind of military precision that suggested someone who understood the importance of proper documentation. In environments where paperwork mistakes could result in career-ending administrative disasters, the transfer orders bore the official seals and signatures that transformed requests into commands, suggestions into requirements. "I have orders for a 2-week cross-training exercise," she continued, placing the folder on their table with the careful precision of someone handling sensitive equipment. "Integration training between A-10 and multi-role fighter squadrons, scheduled to commence 0600 tomorrow morning. My aircraft is being prepped on the north ramp as we speak." Viper picked up the folder with the theatrical attention of someone examining evidence at a crime scene, his eyes scanning the official letterhead and authorization codes that transformed Sarah's presence from voluntary to mandatory. His expression shifted subtly as he processed the implications of what he was reading, the reality that this wasn't a casual visit or informal consultation, but an official assignment that would disrupt their comfortable routine for the next 14 days. "Cross-training," he repeated, his voice carrying the tone of someone tasting something unpleasant. between A-10s and actual fighter aircraft. He set the paperwork down like it was contaminated, his fingers drumming against the metal table, in a rhythm that suggested barely controlled irritation. And what exactly are we supposed to learn from someone who flies a titanium bathtub at the speed of a commercial airliner? Sarah's expression remained neutral, professional, giving no indication that the casual insult had registered on any emotional level. She'd heard variations of the titanium bathtub joke in squadron-ready rooms from Germany to Japan, always delivered with the same mixture of superiority and dismissal that fast-mover pilots seemed to reserve for anyone who flew aircraft that couldn't break the sound barrier or disappear from radar screens like electronic phantoms. The exercise focuses on integrated close air support scenarios, she replied, her voice maintaining the same level tone that suggested this was simply business, nothing personal. Multi-role fighters providing air superiority while A-10s deliver precision ground attack capabilities in complex threat environments. The idea is to maximize the effectiveness of mixed aircraft formations in contested airspace. Razor laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut glass. Integrated formations? You mean we're supposed to slow down to keep pace with your museum piece while enemy SAMs track our approach for 20 minutes? That's not tactics, that's suicide with extra steps. The energy drink in his hand crinkled as his grip tightened, the aluminum giving way under pressure that seemed disproportionate to the conversation's intensity. His flight suit bore the patches of someone who'd completed advanced training programs in electronic warfare and stealth tactics, someone who'd invested years learning to exploit the technological advantages that kept modern fighter pilots alive. In environments where split-second decisions determined whether you came home with mission success or became a casualty statistic in someone's after-action report, Hawk studied Sarah with the calculating attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces didn't quite fit together. His weathered hands folded across his chest, his posture suggesting the kind of patience that came from years of watching young pilots learn hard lessons about assumptions and reality. There was something in his expression that suggested he was seeing details that his younger colleagues were missing, cataloging information that didn't quite match their preconceptions about A-10 pilots and their capabilities. "What's your background, Captain?" he asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than dismissive skepticism. "Where are you transitioning from?" Sarah's pause was barely perceptible, a momentary hesitation that suggested the question touched on subjects that weren't easily summarized in casual conversation. Her green eyes held depths that spoke of experiences that couldn't be captured in official records or training transcripts. The kind of knowledge that came from operating in environments where theoretical discussions about aircraft capabilities became life-and-death realities measured in seconds and split-second decisions. "Multiple deployments," she replied simply, offering neither elaboration nor apology for her brevity. "Various theaters of operation. Standard rotation pattern for A-10 pilot supporting ground operations in contested environments." The answer was technically accurate while revealing nothing substantive about her actual experience, the kind of response that military personnel learned to give when discussing operations that existed in classified databases and redacted mission reports. It was the verbal equivalent of a polite deflection, acknowledging the question while providing no information that could be used to make judgments about her qualifications or background. Viper glanced at his watch, a gesture that managed to convey both impatience and dismissal without requiring verbal explanation. The chronometer on his wrist was military issue, designed to function in environments where precise timing could determine mission success or failure, but his use of it in this context suggested something closer to theatrical boredom than operational necessity. "Look, Captain," he said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to someone who should have already understood them. "I'm sure you're very good at what you do. Supporting ground troops, making holes in buildings. Scaring goats, whatever it is that A-10 pilots consider combat these days. But this squadron flies real missions against real threats. We don't have time to babysit antique aircraft or teach museum curators how modern air warfare actually works. Sarah accepted the dismissal with the same neutral expression she'd maintained. Throughout the conversation, her posture neither defensive nor aggressive, simply professional. She reached for her transfer orders, folding them once with precise military corners before returning them to her breast pocket. The movement was economical, practiced, suggesting someone who'd faced similar dismissals before and had learned. That arguing rarely changed minds that were already made up. "Understood," she said simply, her voice carrying no trace of anger or disappointment. "I'll coordinate with squadron operations to reschedule the training exercise for when your flight schedule permits." But Viper wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who just won an argument he didn't realize he was fighting, his expression shifting from dismissive to something approaching condescending amusement. "Reschedule? Captain, I don't think you understand the situation here. This isn't about scheduling conflicts or operational tempo. This is about fundamental incompatibility between modern air warfare and whatever it is you think you're bringing to the table." Razor nodded enthusiastically, his energy drink-fueled confidence building momentum as he sensed support for his position. "Exactly. The 64th Aggressor Squadron simulates enemy fighter tactics against frontline air superiority. Platforms. We're talking about 4th and 5th generation aircraft, advanced radar systems, electronic warfare capabilities that most pilots never even see in training. What possible value could an A-10 add to that kind of sophisticated air combat environment?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft, heavy with implications that went beyond simple operational considerations. Sarah understood what they were really saying. The underlying assumption that her aircraft, and by extension her capabilities, were obsolete relics from an earlier era of warfare. Museum pieces masquerading as combat-effective platforms in an age of stealth technology and beyond visual range engagement capabilities. The A-10 provides close air support capabilities that complement air superiority missions, she replied, her voice maintaining the same professional tone despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere. In contested environments where precision ground attack requires sustained presence over target areas, the platform offers unique advantages in terms of survivability and weapon system effectiveness. Viper laughed, the sound sharp enough to cut through the air conditioning's mechanical hum. "Sustained presence? You mean loitering around the battlefield like a flying target while every enemy soldier with an AK-47 takes potshots at your titanium bathtub? That's not tactics, that's just refusing to acknowledge that warfare has evolved beyond World War II. A small crowd had begun to gather around their table, drawn by the increasingly animated discussion about aircraft capabilities and mission effectiveness. 3 junior pilots from another squadron approached with the curious expressions of people sensing entertainment in the form of professional disagreement between senior aviators. Their flight suits bore the patches of recent graduates from various training programs, young officers still learning the subtle hierarchies and territorial disputes that defined military aviation culture. "What's the discussion about?" asked Lieutenant Torch Williams, his callsign embroidered in gold thread that still showed factory creases. His question carried the eager enthusiasm of someone hoping to witness a technical debate between experienced pilots, the kind of educational entertainment that helped junior officers understand the complex dynamics of modern air warfare. "Captain, Vance here thinks her A-10 belongs in integrated training exercises with actual fighter aircraft," Razor explained, his voice carrying the tone of someone sharing a particularly absurd joke. "She wants us to pretend that a subsonic ground attack platform has something valuable to contribute to air superiority training scenarios." The junior pilots, exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their understanding of aircraft hierarchies and the social dynamics that separated different aviation communities within the Air Force. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to polite skepticism, influenced by the clear dismissal in Razor's voice and the obvious amusement of the senior pilots who were treating Sarah's presence as a source of entertainment rather than professional consultation. Is it true that A-10s are so slow that enemy fighters can literally fly circles around them? Asked Lieutenant Phoenix Davis, her question carrying the innocent curiosity of someone who'd heard stories but never witnessed the reality of different aircraft capabilities in actual combat situations. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Hawk noticed something flicker behind her eyes, a brief spark that suggested these were abstract theoretical discussions for her. The older pilot had spent enough years in military aviation to recognize the difference between pilots who talked about combat and pilots who'd actually experienced it, and something about Sarah's controlled responses suggested she fell into the latter category. The A-10's maximum speed is approximately 450 miles per hour, Sarah replied factually, addressing Phoenix's question with the same professional courtesy she'd maintained throughout the increasingly hostile conversation. Modern fighter aircraft typically cruise at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour and can achieve supersonic velocities when required. The speed differential is significant in certain tactical scenarios. Significant? Viper's voice dripped with mock amazement. That's like comparing a Ferrari to a tractor and calling the performance gap significant. Your flying farm equipment couldn't catch a modern fighter if it had a 10-minute head start and GPS coordinates. The laughter that followed had an edge to it, the kind that transformed from professional amusement to something approaching cruelty without anyone noticing the transition. Sarah stood in the center of it, surrounded by pilots who decided she represented everything obsolete about military aviation, everything that needed to be replaced by faster, smarter, more technologically advanced solutions to aerial warfare challenges. "Look," Razor said, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to someone who should have understood them intuitively. "I'm sure you're very dedicated to your aircraft and your mission. But this is 2024, not 1944. Modern air warfare is about stealth, speed, and standoff engagement capabilities. Getting close to the enemy isn't brave anymore, it's just stupid." Sarah didn't argue with their assessment, didn't defend her aircraft's capabilities, didn't reveal the classified operations where those same slow characteristics had meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Instead, she simply nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged their expertise without conceding their conclusions, and stepped back from their table toward a row of metal folding chairs positioned near the operations desk where she could observe the flight line through heat-distorted windows. "Take care, Captain," Viper called after her, his voice carrying the dismissive politeness of someone who just solved a minor administrative problem. "Maybe you can find some ground support units that need close air support training. I hear the Army is always looking for flying artillery these days." More laughter followed her retreat, the sound echoing off the metal walls of the operations building like shell casings hitting concrete. Sarah settled into one of the chairs with the same deliberate care she'd shown entering the building, her back straight but not rigid, her hands folded in her lap with the kind of stillness that suggested complete comfort with waiting indefinitely for circumstances to change. Through the windows, she could see the flight line stretching toward the distant mountains, heat waves rising from the asphalt in shimmering curtains that made everything dance like mirages. F-22 Raptors sat in their hardened aircraft shelters, their angular stealth profiles looking more like geometric abstractions than flying machines, their radar-absorbent coatings drinking in sunlight and converting it to heat that made the air around them ripple like water. Nearby, F-35 Lightning IIs underwent pre-flight inspections, their pilots walking around the aircraft with the confident strides of people Who knew they piloted the most advanced fighter jets in human history? Ground crews attended to each aircraft with the reverence reserved for equipment that cost more than most nations' annual defense budgets. Their movements precise and practiced as they verified system status and weapons configurations. And in the distance, barely visible through the heat distortion, sat a single A-10 Thunderbolt II. On the north ramp were transient aircraft parked during temporary duty assignments. Even from this distance, the aircraft looked different from its sleek neighbors, its straight wings and twin engines giving it the utilitarian appearance that had earned it comparisons to flying tanks and armored tractors from pilots who confused elegance with effectiveness. Behind her, the conversation continued with renewed enthusiasm as more pilots joined the discussion about aircraft capabilities and the evolution of air warfare doctrine. Their voices carried the confident authority of people who'd studied theoretical engagements and simulation scenarios, who understood the mathematical relationships between speed, altitude, and survivability in contested airspace environments. The whole concept of close air support is changing, Lieutenant Phoenix was saying, her voice carrying the eagerness of someone sharing newly acquired knowledge. Why risk aircraft and pilots in low-altitude environments when precision-guided munitions can achieve the same effects from safe standoff distances? It's more efficient, more cost-effective, and dramatically reduces exposure to enemy air defense systems. Exactly, agreed another voice that Sarah didn't recognize. Probably another junior pilot drawn by the animated discussion. The A-10 was designed to fight the Soviet Union in European terrain during the 1970s. Different threat environment, different tactical requirements, completely different strategic context. Applying Cold War solutions to modern conflicts is like using a musket in a laser fight. Sarah listened to their analysis with the same neutral expression she'd maintained throughout the morning, neither agreeing nor disagreeing with assessments that revealed their understanding of air warfare came primarily from briefing rooms and computer simulations rather than actual combat experience. She'd heard similar discussions in squadron-ready rooms across 3 different continents, always the same arguments between pilots who flew different missions with different aircraft designed for different purposes. What they couldn't understand, what simulation training couldn't teach them, was that sometimes the enemy shot back in ways that no computer model could predict. Sometimes weather systems moved faster than meteorological forecasts suggested. Sometimes communications failed at precisely the wrong moment, leaving ground forces isolated with nothing but radio static and the hope that someone was still listening when they called for help. A master sergeant walked past her chair, tools rattling in his canvas bag, his flight line badge catching fluorescent light as he moved with the purposeful stride of someone responding to a maintenance discrepancy that couldn't wait for convenient scheduling. He glanced at Sarah with the curious expression of someone trying to understand why a pilot would sit quietly in the operations building instead of preparing for flight operations or attending briefings. "Ma'am," he said, slowing his pace slightly. "You need assistance with anything? Transportation to billeting, directions to the flight line, anything like that?" Sarah looked up with green eyes that held depths the sergeant couldn't quite read, something that reminded him of deep water where currents ran stronger than surface appearances suggested. There was kindness in her expression, patience that seemed infinite, as if she could sit in that metal chair until the desert cooled and the mountains crumbled without ever feeling the need to move or complain or demand attention. Just waiting. "Sergeant," she replied simply, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd learned that most problems solve themselves, given sufficient time and patience. "Flight scheduling, you know how it is." The sergeant nodded with the understanding of someone who'd spent 20 years watching pilots navigate the complex bureaucracy of military flight operations, where perfectly reasonable requests could become administrative nightmares depending on which forms were filed with which offices at which times. He'd seen pilots wait for hours while paperwork circulated through approval chains, that seemed designed more for thoroughness than efficiency. "Copy that, ma'am. Let me know if you need anything." As the sergeant disappeared through the operations door, Sarah returned her attention to the flight line, where afternoon training sorties were beginning to launch. F-22s taxied toward the active runway with the predatory grace of apex predators, their pilots invisible behind tinted canopies that reflected desert sun like mirrors. The sound of their engines carried across the base, even through the building's insulation, a low rumble that spoke of barely contained power waiting to be unleashed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The afternoon heat had settled into a rhythm of its own, the kind of desert furnace that made even veteran aircrew think twice about extended operations outside air-conditioned spaces. Sarah continued to wait with the patience of someone who'd learned that military efficiency operated on its own timeline, where urgent requests could become administrative exercises that stretched across multiple duty shifts and involved personnel who seemed to specialize in finding reasons why simple tasks required complex approval processes. Senior Master Sergeant Jake Wrench Morrison had been maintaining military aircraft for 28 years, long enough to have worked on everything from Vietnam-era F-4 Phantoms to the latest stealth fighters that looked more like origami sculptures than flying machines. His hands bore the permanent stains of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel, his knuckles scarred from countless encounters with recalcitrant bolts and stubborn access panels that seemed designed by engineers who'd never actually touched a real aircraft. He walked through the operations building carrying a clipboard thick with maintenance forms and discrepancy reports, his experienced eyes automatically cataloging everything from the condition of the fluorescent light fixtures to the way various personnel carried themselves. 28 years of military service had taught him to read people the same way he read aircraft systems, looking for subtle signs that indicated whether everything was functioning normally or whether problems were developing beneath surface appearances. Morrison's attention was caught by the woman sitting near the windows, not because she was doing anything remarkable, but because of how perfectly still she remained in an environment where most people fidgeted, checked their phones, or found excuses to move around. Military pilots, in his experience, were generally high-energy individuals who struggled with extended periods of inactivity, especially young officers who hadn't yet learned that patience was often more valuable than enthusiasm. But there was something different about this one. She sat with the kind of controlled stillness that Morrison had seen only in specific types of military personnel, usually people who'd operated in environments where unnecessary movement could attract unwanted attention from individuals with hostile intentions and accurate weapons. Her breathing was controlled, economical, suggesting someone who'd learned to manage stress responses in situations where panic could be fatal. As Morrison moved closer, his experienced eyes began cataloging details that most people would miss. The woman's flight boots showed wear patterns that didn't match typical stateside training operations. The leather was scuffed in places that suggested extended exposure to foreign soil, the kind of abrasion patterns that came from walking across airfields in places where maintenance facilities were improvised and ground conditions were less than ideal. Her flight suit, hanging from her chair, bore the regulation patches and markings that identified her as an A-10 pilot. But Morrison noticed something that made his blood pressure spike. Barely visible beneath her squadron patch, so faded it was almost imperceptible, was the outline of another patch that had been removed with the kind of careful precision that suggested official reasons rather than personal preference. Morrison had seen those ghost marks before, usually on uniforms belonging to personnel who'd transferred from units whose very existence was classified above his clearance level. The shape of the removed patch was distinctive enough that someone with his experience could make educated guesses about its origin. especially when combined with other subtle indicators that suggested this pilot's background included operations that didn't appear in official records. Her hands, visible as she adjusted her position slightly, bore scars that Morrison recognized from his own experience maintaining aircraft that had returned from combat with battle damage. Small, precise marks on her knuckles and wrists that came from emergency repairs performed under hostile conditions, the kind of field work that pilots sometimes had to do when ground crews weren't available and aircraft needed to fly again before proper maintenance facilities could be accessed. But what made Morrison's chest to tighten with sudden recognition was a detail so small that most people would have dismissed it as coincidence. Attached to her flight bag's zipper pull was a small metal tag, no bigger than a dog tag, bearing numbers and letters that meant nothing to casual observers, but everything to someone who understood the organizational structure of special operations. Aviation units. The tag was weathered enough to suggest years of use, its edges worn smooth by constant handling, but the markings were still legible to someone who knew what to look for. Morrison had seen similar tags exactly 3 times in his career, always attached to equipment belonging to pilots whose missions were redacted from official records and whose aircraft modifications were classified above his security clearance level. The numbers indicated not just a unit designation, but a specific type of operation that existed in the shadow spaces between official military doctrine and necessary action. Units that operated under authorities that bypassed normal command structures, flying missions that couldn't be acknowledged, and achieving objectives that couldn't be celebrated because admitting they had happened would compromise ongoing operations. In multiple theaters, Morrison felt his hands begin to shake slightly as the implications settled into his consciousness, like pieces of a puzzle that suddenly revealed a picture he hadn't expected to see. The woman sitting quietly in the operations building wasn't just another A-10 pilot transitioning through routine training exercises. She was something far more significant, someone whose presence at Nellis Air Force Base represented a level of expertise that the young hotshots in their stealth fighters couldn't begin to comprehend. He thought about the conversation he'd overheard earlier, the casual dismissal of A-10 capabilities by pilots who'd never operated in environments where theoretical advantages became meaningless in the face of practical realities. Their jokes about flying tractors and titanium bathtubs suddenly seemed not just inappropriate, but dangerously ignorant, revealing a fundamental misunderstanding of what military aviation was really about. Morrison approached Sarah's position with the respectful caution of someone who just realized he was in the presence of military aristocracy, the kind of pilot whose exploits existed only in whispered conversations and classified after-action reports. His 28 years of experience had taught him to recognize excellence in all its forms, but this was something beyond excellence, something that approached the legendary. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying the respect that came from understanding exactly who he was addressing. "Master Sergeant Morrison, I couldn't help but notice your gear. That's some very specific hardware you're carrying." Sarah looked up at him with green eyes that held depths Morrison couldn't fully read, but her expression remained neutral, neither confirming nor denying whatever conclusions he might have drawn from his observations. She was clearly accustomed to people who noticed details that others missed, comfortable with the kind of scrutiny that came from operating in environments where everyone's life depended on accurate assessment of capabilities and intentions. "Is it?" she replied simply, offering neither explanation nor apology for whatever he thought he'd discovered. Morrison nodded slowly, understanding that some conversations couldn't be conducted in public spaces where unauthorized personnel might overhear information that wasn't meant for general distribution. But his recognition of her true status was complete, and everything about the morning's events suddenly made perfect, terrible sense. Morrison's eyes moved to Sarah's left wrist, where a simple watch caught the fluorescent light in a way that revealed details invisible to casual observation. The timepiece wasn't standard military issue. wasn't the kind of rugged chronometer that most pilots wore for routine flight operations. Instead, it bore the subtle markings of specialized equipment issued only to personnel whose missions required precise timing coordination across multiple time zones and operational theaters that existed beyond normal military command structures. The watch face showed multiple subdials for tracking different time references simultaneously, a feature that seemed unnecessary until you understood that some operations required coordination between units operating under different temporal frameworks while maintaining absolute secrecy about their actual locations and objectives. Morrison had seen similar equipment exactly twice in his career, both times on the wrists of pilots whose aircraft had returned from missions that officially never happened. "Ma'am," Morrison said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I think there might be some people here who don't fully understand what they're dealing with." Before Sarah could respond, the operations building door opened with the sharp crack of aluminum against concrete, admitting a wave of superheated air and the distinctive sound of approaching rotor blades. Colonel Patricia Steele Hawkins entered, with the purposeful stride of someone responding to information that had transformed a routine afternoon into something requiring immediate command attention. Hawkins had commanded the 64th Aggressor Squadron for 18 months, long enough to understand the complex dynamics between different aircraft communities and the Côte communities, territorial disputes that sometimes erupted when pilots from various backgrounds were forced to operate in shared airspace. Her own background included combat tours in multiple theaters, flying everything from A-10s to F-16s, before transitioning to command positions that required political skills as much as aviation expertise. She'd received Morrison's message through back channels, the kind of informal communication network that allowed experienced senior enlisted personnel to provide commanders with information that might not surface through official reporting structures. Morrison's 28 years of experience gave his observations weight that couldn't be dismissed, especially when he used phrases like special access required and classification above my clearance level. Hawkins stopped 3 steps inside the building, her experienced eyes immediately locating Sarah among the scattered personnel and maintenance equipment. Even from across the room, the colonel could see details that confirmed Morrison's assessment, subtle indicators that suggested this wasn't just another pilot transitioning through routine training exercises, but someone whose presence represented capabilities that most people never encountered. Sarah's posture remained relaxed but ready, the kind of controlled alertness that came from operating in environments where situational awareness could mean the difference between successful mission completion and becoming a casualty statistic in someone's classified after-action report. Her breathing pattern suggested the kind of stress management training that was provided only to personnel whose operations required them to function effectively under extreme pressure while maintaining absolute operational security. "Captain Vance," Colonel Hawkins said, her voice carrying the authority of command, but tempered with something approaching cautious respect. "I understand there's been some discussion about integrated training exercises and aircraft capabilities." Sarah stood with fluid precision, her movement economical and practiced, suggesting someone who'd performed this courtesy in situations where military protocol mattered more than personal comfort. Her expression remained neutral, professional, giving no indication of how she might respond to whatever was coming next. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied simply, her voice maintaining the same controlled tone she'd used throughout the morning's increasingly hostile encounters with pilots who dismissed her aircraft and, by extension, her capabilities as obsolete relics from an earlier era of warfare. Hawkins studied Sarah's face with the calculating attention of someone trying to reconcile official records with personal observation, looking for confirmation of suspicions that had been triggered by Morrison's urgent communication about specialized equipment and classification levels that exceeded normal squadron operations. The colonel had accessed Sarah's official service record, but like many personnel files for special operations aviators, it contained more redacted sections than actual information. "Your service record makes for interesting reading," Hawkins continued, her tone suggesting she understood the significance of what wasn't included in official documentation as much as what was explicitly stated. "Multiple combat deployments, specialized training programs, commendations that reference operations I don't have clearance to discuss." The operations building had fallen silent except for the mechanical hum of air conditioning systems and the distant sound of aircraft engines. As afternoon training sorties continued their complex dance across Nevada airspace, even the junior pilots who'd been engaged in animated discussions about aircraft capabilities had stopped talking, sensing that something significant was developing that went beyond their understanding of routine squadron operations. Morrison positioned himself near the communications desk where he could observe the interaction while maintaining appropriate military courtesy, his experienced eyes cataloging every detail of an encounter that he suspected would become part of Squadron lore for years to come. His 28 years of service had taught him to recognize moments when military routine intersected with something extraordinary, when ordinary people discovered they were in the presence of capabilities they'd never imagined. Viper and Razor had noticed the colonel's arrival and the sudden shift in atmospheric tension, their earlier confidence evaporating as they began to understand that their casual dismissal of Sarah's presence might have been based on incomplete information. The two pilots exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their growing suspicion that they'd made serious errors in judgment about someone whose background contained elements they hadn't considered. "Ma'am," Sarah said carefully, "my record reflects standard assignment patterns for A-10 pilots supporting ground operations in various theaters. Nothing that should require special attention or consideration beyond normal squadron integration procedures." But Hawkins had noticed something that confirmed every suspicion Morrison's message had triggered. Behind Sarah's left ear, partially concealed by her regulation haircut, was a tattoo so small it was almost invisible unless viewed from precisely the right angle under specific lighting conditions. The design was simple but unmistakable to someone who understood the symbolic language used by units whose very existence was classified above most security clearance levels. The tattoo was a simple geometric design. Two intersected triangles with a single dot centered between them, rendered in black ink that had faded to charcoal with age and exposure to desert sun and foreign environments. To most observers, it would appear to be decorative artwork, perhaps a personal symbol or cultural reference that held meaning only to the wearer. But Colonel Hawkins had seen that specific design exactly once before, in a classified briefing about units that operated under authorities that bypassed normal military command structures. "Captain," Hawkins said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of sudden understanding, "I believe there may have been some miscommunication about your qualifications and operational background." The emergency klaxon shattered the afternoon quiet. With its piercing wail, the sound cutting through air conditioning and conversation like a blade through silk. Red warning lights began strobing throughout the operations building, casting everything in alternating shadows and harsh illumination that transformed familiar spaces into something urgent and threatening. The duty officer's voice crackled through overhead speakers with the flat authority of someone delivering information that had just turned a routine training day into something approaching real-world crisis. "All available aircraft, scramble order Alpha 7. Search and rescue emergency, Nellis range 74. Military aircraft down, crew status unknown, hostile weather moving in. Estimated 40-minute window before conditions deteriorate beyond recovery. Capability." Morrison felt his blood pressure spike as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. Range 74 was notorious among flight crews for its unforgiving terrain, a maze of canyons and ridgelines that had claimed aircraft and aircrew over the decades since it had been designated as a training area. when weather systems moved through that particular slice of Nevada geography, they created conditions that challenged even the most experienced pilots in sophisticated aircraft. Viper and Razor were already moving toward the door, their earlier conversation about aircraft capabilities forgotten in the face of actual emergency requirements. Their flight suits rustled as they grabbed helmets and equipment bags, their movements sharp with adrenaline and professional urgency. But Hawkins raised her hand in a gesture that stopped them before they reached the exit. "Negative," she said. Firmly, weather conditions in the target area are deteriorating rapidly. Wind shear, low ceiling, visibility dropping toward minimums. Current forecast shows conditions that exceed safe operating parameters for high-performance aircraft. The meteorological update scrolled across multiple display screens, showing atmospheric data that painted a picture of developing crisis in the search area. Wind speeds were climbing toward levels that would make precision flying nearly impossible. Visibility was dropping as moisture and dust combined to create an opaque wall that would challenge even the most sophisticated sensor systems, and the terrain itself was becoming increasingly treacherous as shadows lengthened and familiar landmarks disappeared into gray obscurity. "Ma'am," Viper protested, his voice tight with frustration, "we can handle adverse weather conditions. Our aircraft have instruments and navigation systems designed for exactly these kinds of scenarios." "Your aircraft," Hawkins replied, her tone carrying the authority of command backed by technical knowledge, "are optimized for high-altitude, high-speed operations. This mission requires low-altitude precision flying in terrain that doesn't forgive mistakes under weather conditions that will challenge every system you've got." Sarah had remained silent throughout the exchange, but something in her posture had shifted subtly as she processed the emergency information streaming across the operations center displays. Her green eyes tracked the meteorological data with the systematic attention of someone performing calculations that went beyond simple weather analysis, measuring variables that included terrain characteristics, aircraft capabilities, and mission requirements against environmental factors that were changing by the minute. "Colonel," Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the background noise of emergency communications and scrambling personnel, "request permission to respond to the search and rescue emergency." The operations building fell silent except for the mechanical sounds of cooling systems and radio chatter from other units coordinating response efforts. Even the emergency klaxon had stopped its urgent wailing, leaving behind the kind of quiet that made every word carry weight and significance that extended beyond simple military protocol. Hawkins studied Sarah's face with the calculating attention of someone weighing options that carried life and death, consequences for people she'd never met but was responsible for protecting. The colonel's own background included enough combat experience to understand that sometimes the best technical solution wasn't the most obvious one, that capabilities couldn't always be measured by maximum speed or stealth characteristics. "Captain," Hawkins said carefully, "the weather conditions in the target area are severe and deteriorating. Low-altitude flight in mountainous terrain with limited visibility requires specific skills and aircraft characteristics that favor low speed, high survivability platforms with extended loiter capability and weapon systems designed for precision engagement in close proximity to friendly forces." Sarah finished, her voice carrying quiet confidence rather than boastful assertion. Morrison stepped forward, his 28 years of maintenance experience giving weight to his technical assessment of the situation. "Ma'am, the A-10 is specifically designed for exactly this kind of mission profile. Low-altitude operations, adverse weather capability, extended range for search patterns, and if there are hostile forces in the area, ground attack systems that can provide cover for rescue operations." Razor started to object, his mouth opening to voice arguments about advanced avionics and superior performance capabilities, but Hawkins cut him off with a gesture that brooked no discussion. "Captain Vance," the colonel said, her decision crystallizing. As she processed mission requirements against available assets, your aircraft is authorized for immediate launch. All other flights are grounded until weather conditions improve or emergency requirements change. Sarah nodded once, her expression shifting from patient waiting to focused preparation. As she transitioned from administrative visitor to operational pilot responding to actual emergency requirements. Sarah moved toward the exit with the fluid efficiency of someone transitioning from standby to operational status. Her steps measured and purposeful as she mentally shifted from administrative processing to mission execution. Behind her, the operations building buzzed with coordinated activity as personnel adjusted flight schedules and communications frequencies to accommodate the emergency response requirements that had just transformed routine training operations into actual search and rescue efforts. The heat outside struck her like a physical blow, but Sarah barely registered the temperature change as she strode across the scorching tarmac toward the north ramp where her A-10 waited in the afternoon sun. The aircraft sat alone among the sleek fighters, its utilitarian design stark against the geometric elegance of stealth platforms that surrounded it like predators gathered around prey. Ground crew personnel were already performing pre-flight checks with the urgency that emergency missions demanded, their movements sharp and practiced as they verified system status and fuel loads that would determine mission capability and range limitations. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos looked up from her inspection of the aircraft's GAU-8 cannon system, her experienced eyes meeting Sarah's with the kind of professional recognition that passed between aircrew and maintenance personnel who understood their mutual dependence in environments where mechanical failure could be fatal. "Aircraft is mission ready, ma'am," Santos reported, her voice carrying the confidence that came from 20 years of maintaining A-10s in conditions ranging from pristine stateside facilities to improvised forward operating bases where spare parts arrived by helicopter, and maintenance schedules depended more on enemy activity than manufacturer recommendations. Full fuel load, standard ammunition configuration, all systems green across the board. Sarah nodded her appreciation, then began her own pre-flight inspection with the systematic thoroughness that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. In aircraft that had returned from missions bearing battle damage that would have been catastrophic to less robust platforms. Her hands moved across control surfaces and access panels with practiced efficiency, checking items that most pilots verified through cockpit displays, but that she preferred to confirm through direct physical inspection. The A-10's twin engines spooled up with the distinctive whine that separated them from the screaming turbofans of supersonic fighters, their sound more mechanical than musical. Designed for reliability rather than performance at altitudes where thin air challenged less robust power plants. Sarah ran through her checklist items with automatic precision, her fingers finding switches and controls without conscious thought as muscle memory took over the complex dance of aircraft initialization. Through her canopy, she could see Viper and Razor standing near the operations building, their expressions mixing frustration with something approaching curiosity as they watched her prepare for a mission they'd been denied due to weather conditions that their sophisticated aircraft couldn't handle safely. Their F-22s and F-35s possessed capabilities that exceeded her aircraft in every measurable category except the ones that mattered for this particular mission profile. The radio crackled with updates from the search area that painted an increasingly grim picture of conditions deteriorating faster than meteorological models had predicted. Wind speeds were approaching levels that would make precision flying nearly impossible for high-performance aircraft. Visibility was dropping toward minimums that challenged even the most sophisticated navigation systems and the downed crews. Emergency beacon was transmitting from a location that satellite imagery showed as virtually inaccessible to conventional rescue aircraft. Ghost 77, Nellis Tower, you are cleared for immediate departure. Vector 340 degrees. Climb and maintain flight level 180 until reaching the range 74 boundary. Then descend to operational altitude as required for search patterns. Weather conditions in target area are marginal VFR with deteriorating visibility and severe wind shear below 5,000 feet. Sarah acknowledged the clearance with professional brevity, then advanced her throttles with the smooth precision of someone who understood exactly how much power her aircraft needed for optimal performance under current atmospheric conditions. The A-10 rolled forward with deliberate momentum, its landing gear absorbing the irregular surface texture of taxiways that had been softened by heat into something approaching liquid consistency. The takeoff roll seemed to last forever compared to the rocket-like acceleration of modern fighters, but Sarah knew that her aircraft's apparent sluggishness was actually a carefully engineered balance between power and efficiency that would prove invaluable during extended search operations, where fuel consumption mattered more than maximum speed. As the A-10 lifted off the runway, she felt the familiar sensation of commanding an aircraft that was built for sustainability rather than spectacle. Climbing toward the search area, Sarah monitored weather updates that confirmed her initial assessment of mission requirements. The downed aircraft was a two-seat F-16 that had encountered mechanical failure during a routine training sortie, its crew forced to eject over terrain that was challenging under optimal conditions and approaching impossible given current atmospheric circumstances. Their emergency beacon placed them in a canyon system where wind patterns created downdrafts and turbulence that would challenge any aircraft attempting low-altitude operations. As she approached range 74, Sarah could see the weather system developing with the kind of violent beauty that made desert storms simultaneously spectacular and dangerous. Towering cumulus clouds built toward altitudes that exceeded most aircraft service ceilings, their dark bases trailing curtains of precipitation that turned familiar landmarks into gray obscurity and transformed navigation from routine procedure into complex problem-solving exercise. The radio chatter from other search units painted a picture of frustration and mounting concern as helicopters and conventional search aircraft reported conditions that exceeded their operational capabilities. Wind shear was making low-altitude flight dangerous. Visibility was dropping toward levels that required instrument flight procedures, and the terrain itself was becoming increasingly treacherous as familiar reference points disappeared into atmospheric murk. All search units, be advised that weather conditions in primary search area now exceed safe operating parameters for rotary wing aircraft. Fixed-wing assets with appropriate weather capability are requested to continue search operations until conditions improve or emergency requirements change. Sarah descended through turbulence that would have been uncomfortable in a lighter aircraft, feeling the A-10's solid construction absorb atmospheric disturbances that translated into minor vibrations rather than the violent motion that characterized less robust platforms in similar conditions. Sarah switched to the emergency frequency and immediately picked up the weak signal from the downed pilot's survival radio, their voices barely audible through the static created by atmospheric interference and terrain masking that made communication sporadic and difficult to maintain. The transmission was broken, fragmented, but she could make out enough words to understand their situation was deteriorating rapidly as weather conditions continued to worsen around their position. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Falcon 2-3. We have one pilot with suspected spinal injury, cannot move from current location. Weather is getting worse, visibility near zero. We can hear aircraft overhead but cannot signal effectively due to terrain. Masking. Emergency beacon is functioning, but our position is approximately 200 meters north of signal source due to ejection sequence drift." Sarah banked her aircraft into a descending spiral that brought her below the cloud deck, where visibility improved marginally, enough to begin systematic search patterns that took advantage of the A-10's ability to fly slowly enough to actually see ground features through the atmospheric murk that had defeated faster aircraft attempting the same mission. The canyon walls rose around her like the sides of a giant maze, their surfaces slick with moisture that made visual references uncertain in navigation, increasingly dependent on instruments that had to be cross-checked against terrain features that appeared and disappeared in the shifting visibility. Below her, the landscape revealed itself in glimpses through breaks in the weather that lasted only seconds before closing again like doors slamming shut. She could see the search area was even more challenging than satellite imagery had suggested. A complex network of intersecting ravines and rocky outcroppings that created dozens of potential crash sites, where two ejected pilots could be hidden from aerial observation even, under perfect weather conditions. The fuel flow indicators on her instrument panel reminded her that time was becoming a critical factor. Not just because of weather deterioration, but because search and rescue operations had a mathematical relationship between time elapsed and survival probability that decreased with every passing minute. She had enough fuel for approximately 90 minutes of low-altitude search flying, after which she would need to return to base or risk becoming a rescue case herself. Ghost 77, this is rescue control. Be advised we're tracking additional aircraft approaching your search area from the south. Unknown contacts, no response to radio calls, appear to be civilian aircraft, but behaving in patterns inconsistent with normal flight operations. Sarah's blood pressure spiked as she processed the implications of unauthorized aircraft operating in restricted airspace during emergency operations, especially aircraft that weren't responding to air traffic control instructions or identifying themselves according to standard procedures. In her experience, unknown contacts during crisis situations usually meant complications that could transform rescue operations into something requiring defensive capabilities. She adjusted her search pattern to maintain visual contact with the approaching aircraft while continuing to scan for signs of the downed pilots, her eyes moving between terrain features and potential threats with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd learned to process multiple information streams simultaneously while maintaining aircraft control in challenging environmental conditions. Unknown aircraft resolved into two small civilian planes, possibly drug runners using the confusion of emergency operations to mask their own illegal activities. A common tactic in border regions where legitimate search and rescue efforts provided cover for criminal enterprises that exploited gaps in official attention and resources. But Sarah's immediate concern remained the downed pilots whose survival depended on her ability to locate them before weather conditions made rescue impossible or before their injuries progressed beyond the point where medical intervention could be effective. She dropped lower into the canyon system, using terrain masking to avoid detection by the unknown aircraft, while maximizing her visual search capability in areas where conventional rescue aircraft couldn't operate safely. A glint of reflection caught her attention, sunlight bouncing off something metallic, in a narrow ravine that satellite imagery had classified as inaccessible to aircraft operations. Sarah rolled into a steep bank that brought her aircraft parallel to the canyon wall, close enough to see two figures waving frantically from a position that would have been impossible to spot from higher altitudes or faster approach speeds. Falcon 2-3, Ghost 77 has visual contact. You are located in Ravine Charlie, approximately 200 meters north of your beacon signal, as reported. One pilot appears mobile, one appears to be lying down. Confirm your status and emergency medical requirements. Ghost 77, thank God someone found us. We have one pilot with back injury, cannot move him without proper medical support. We need immediate helicopter evacuation, but weather conditions are too severe for rotary wing operations. Can you provide cover for ground rescue team approach? Sarah assessed the tactical situation with the rapid calculation that combat experience had made automatic, weighing factors that included terrain accessibility, weather deterioration rates, unknown aircraft intentions, and the medical urgency. of injured personnel who needed evacuation within a specific time window to prevent permanent disability or death. The ravine was too narrow for helicopter operations, even under optimal conditions. The weather was continuing to deteriorate beyond safe operating parameters for most aircraft, and the approaching unknown contacts added a layer of complexity that could transform rescue operations into combat situations requiring capabilities that most search and rescue assets didn't possess. But the A-10 had been designed for exactly these kinds of scenarios, where multiple threat factors combined with challenging environmental conditions to create situations that required aircraft capable of sustained operations in contested environments, while providing both reconnaissance and defensive capabilities that could protect friendly forces during vulnerable operations. Sarah keyed her radio with decision that crystallized as she fully understood why her aircraft had been the only option available for this mission. Why speed and stealth mattered less than durability and persistence. When human lives hung in the balance, Sarah coordinated the rescue with precision that turned chaos into choreographed efficiency. She established a defensive perimeter around the downed pilots while guiding ground rescue teams through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate without her low-altitude reconnaissance. When the unknown aircraft revealed themselves as hostile forces attempting to exploit the emergency situation, Sarah's GA-U-8 cannon convinced them to reconsider their intentions with a demonstration of firepower that sent them fleeing toward international airspace. The injured pilot was extracted successfully, his spinal injury stabilized by medical personnel who reached the crash site using coordinates and approach routes that only Sarah's slow, methodical search pattern could have identified. Weather conditions that had grounded every other aircraft on the base proved manageable for the A-10's robust systems and Sarah's patient flying skills. Back at Nellis, Viper and Razor waited on the flight line as Sarah's aircraft appeared through the clearing storm clouds. The same pilots who dismissed her slow plane hours earlier now watched in humbled silence as she landed with the quiet competence that had just saved 2 lives and prevented an international incident. Colonel Hawkins met Sarah at the aircraft, her expression mixing professional respect with personal admiration. "Outstanding work, Captain. Your aircraft and your skills prove today that sometimes the old ways are still the best ways." Sarah simply nodded, removed her helmet, and walked toward the debriefing room. Behind her, Morrison was already posting mission success updates that would become part of Squadron legend. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community of everyday heroes. We share incredible true stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. What's your most inspiring military story? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Your subscription helps us bring more of these powerful stories to light.